Thanks, Rhonda. So Rhonda is our school outreach coordinator here at CSWD and has been doing that for 8 years or so, Rhonda?
6
6 years. I'm getting ahead of myself. I know it's more than me. I'm business outreach for CSWD and have been doing it for about 4 years. So thank you for joining us today. We will bring up a PowerPoint here and get rolling.
And thanks for joining us on this sunny Tuesday.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good to go. You seeing that, Rhonda?
Yepers.
Terrific. So we'll start just by going over what we're going to cover today. We like to introduce ourselves, of course, and our organization, talk a little bit about why we're all talking about composting and keeping our food scraps out of the trash these days, as well as highlighting some of the special benefits of the product, the compost as a soil amendment. And then there are 6 core steps to composting, and we have some demo videos to show you to reinforce the composting process, and Q&A both as we go and at the end. So without further ado, Chittenden Solid Waste District. So we are a municipality, meaning that we are board governed, mission driven, not for profit. And we have a board of commissioners with a volunteer commissioner from each town, each of the 18 towns in Chittenden County, because we are right along county lines representing the businesses and residents of all the towns in Chittenden County. And we also have local requirements around waste management that sometimes go beyond what the state requires. So that's our Solid Waste Management Ordinance, SWMO. You may be most familiar with our organization because of the facilities you visit. So our drop-off centers are among our more public-facing facilities, and they are places where people who don't have their trash and recycling picked up curbside can bring their trash and mixed recycling. But they are also places to bring lots of different kinds of special recycling, especially our Williston drop-off center, which is sort of the central hub for the special recycling program, including appliances, tires, mercury-containing devices, scrap metal, and so forth. So if you haven't been to one, know that that's a great place to bring your batteries, scrap metal, and so forth. We also have the hazardous waste facility, the environmental depot, good place to bring your paint and your chemicals. That is by appointment these days, but it is quite easy to get an appointment. And generally we accept hazardous waste from Chittenden County residents at no charge. That's behind the airport, open to the public Wednesday through Saturday, again by appointment. Our materials recovery facility is where we sort all the blue bin recycling. So unless you've been on a tour, you may never have been there, but it's a very important facility to what we do. And basically everything gets sorted there, separated by material, baled, and you see the bales, some of the bales there in the picture, and then sent off to market. And we get some, in many cases, revenue back for that recycled material. And then Green Mountain Compost is our organics facility that is very busy these days, processing about 6,000 tons a year of food scraps and increasing as more and more people are following the law and diverting their food scraps from the trash. And we have some big changes going on there as well as we've been expanding that. We'd like to point out that the trash that we generate, or the other things that wind up in the trash, whether they needed to be there or not, are going to the only operational landfill in the state, and that's in Coventry, Vermont, about 75 miles from the center of Chittenden County, which means that you're talking about many tractor trailer trips a day, and those round trips are about 150 miles. So you can think of all the trucking impacts of that. So yeah, like 10 or more tractor trailer trips a day. And so we ask you to think about what we all generate. So in terms of a per capita or per person number of pounds that we generate per day, and would think about not only what you're personally creating, but the things that maybe perhaps the businesses that you're using that exist here also produce in their operations, because that's going to be, it's all of the trash divided by the number of people here. So let's
before you go forward with that, I just want them to type in the Q&A what their guess is. How many pounds of trash per person you think? So
And right, we won't hold it against you if you get this wrong, because it's not an easy thing to know if you don't not in this industry. So take a crack at it. No judgment.
We got a 4 pounds per day.
Cool.
One brave soul out there willing to put in their answer. Come on. You got this. All right. Well, that was darn close, Kevin.
So going back to that point about all the material we're sending to the landfill and all the impacts of sending all that material to the landfill, we pull up this slide, which is from 2019 data, but you can see that the trash portion of that, this is the actual material that was sent to Coventry, and the trash portion was only 53%. The remaining 47%, almost half of what was sent, was stuff that could have gone to different and higher use than being landfilled, such as being composted. The organics fraction you see there is both food scraps and yard waste. And this is before the law change, so we're hopeful that that almost quarter of the material that was food scraps, that wedge is getting smaller now as people are keeping their food scraps out of the trash and composting them and so forth. The other slices are smaller, but still significant in terms of the special recycling, things like scrap metal that could have been kept out, the blue bin recyclables that could have been put in the bin and sent to the MRF, and recoverable C&D includes things like asphalt shingles and unpainted drywall scrap. Those are recyclable construction materials. So, Kevin, excellent guess with 4 pounds. We'll round to 4. Sounds good. So yeah, the answer is 4.1 pounds per person per day here in Chittenden County these days.
You get the winning high five, Kevin. Winning high five.
And that is your local landfill. I mean, local meaning halfway across the state, but that is what Coventry looks like. And one of the things about, so yes, almost a quarter of what we were sending to landfill was food scraps, but the impacts of that food material actually are greater than just a quarter of the impact. They are contribute disproportionately to the outputs of a landfill that have to be managed. Your landfill again. And those outputs are landfill gas, which is emitted from the material that's landfill, and leachate. That's the garbage juice, the runoff. So if you think about what's in your trash, the food scraps are the juicy stuff. There's not a lot of liquid or water in plastic or the other things that you may find in your trash. So it's really the food scraps that are contributing most of the leachate that is running out of the material and then running through potentially hazardous stuff or things that you don't want to be drinking for sure, and therefore becoming contaminated with that stuff so that it needs to be treated at the nearest wastewater treatment plant, which is not there on site. It needs to be pumped into tanker trucks, and 30,000 to 50,000 gallons a day of leachate has to be managed a day at the landfill, brought to wastewater treatment plants in Newport or Montpelier to be treated. The landfill gas, until the cells are sealed, that is going into the atmosphere, where the methane, and that's most of it, is a very potent greenhouse gas. So that's one of the things that we're trying to avoid, is losing all that methane to then go and contribute to climate change. Yes, in Coventry, there is some power generation. They collect the methane they can through pipes that are embedded in the material, and it is used to power homes, but there are plenty of opportunities for it to escape, especially in those pictures you saw earlier. Like in this phase, there is no collection of the methane coming off. It's only when the cell is fully sealed. And on that note, we point to what a landfill looks like these days, and it has a lot of infrastructure, and that's to manage those outputs. So the liner on the bottom is mostly to protect the groundwater from the leachate that will otherwise wind up in it. Instead, it collects in the bottom and is pumped out. And then there's more lining on top. before soil is added, and that's to both keep methane and odors from escaping, as well as not to let any precipitation in, which will then create more leachate. You know, the more material that, the more water that filters through the material, the more leachate there is to manage. So for those reasons, essentially a landfill is much more high tech than the dumps of the past that were essentially just a hole in the ground. But it also is much more of a plastic tomb that does not let anything in or out, which means that there are not a lot of the facilitators of decomposition. You know, sunlight, air, and water are things that facilitate decomposition in the natural environment, and a landfill is no longer a natural environment at all. And so these carrots are an example of that. They are 10-year-old carrots. They were buried in a landfill, not locally. This is in the Southwest, but they were still recognizable as carrots, although a little bit discolored after 10 years. And we know they were in there 10 years because the newspaper that was buried next to them was dated 10 years prior and still legible. So both the carrots and the newspaper illustrate how little decomposition happens in a modern landfill, which we contrast with what happens when we put our food scraps in a compost pile. And the main difference is that there is oxygen accessible in a compost pile, and we make sure that that's part of our process, is to make sure there's oxygen accessible to the material, which will facilitate decomposition, so that the carrots, those carrots that you saw in the picture, even on your front lawn, untended, would break down, you know, in a matter of weeks or months, in a way that they will not in the landfill. And then in a compost bin, what you're seeing here, and this is Rhonda's experiment. So credit to Rhonda for thinking to seal these carrots in a mesh bag and put it in a minimally managed compost bin, pulling them out, you know, every couple of weeks to note results. Anything you want to share with us about the experiment, Rhonda?
No, I was just gonna say, you can take the girl out of the lab, but you can never take the laboratory out of the girl.
Right on, right on. Well, I think this slide illustrates really well how, you know, even after 4 weeks, the carrots are less recognizable in a compost pile than after 10 years in a landfill. So we recap that, you know, one of the main reasons for composting is combat climate change. And sometimes people aren't making that connection. So we want to be really clear that that is one of the key reasons. There are something like, it's over 10% of the methane emissions in the United States are from landfills. So it's also, of course, conserving resources. The nutrients in the food are a resource, and the landfill space is precious and finite. We don't know where the next landfill will be. Nobody, of course, wants it in their backyard. So it's very unclear what will happen when Coventry eventually fills up. And that is a real consideration as well. Obviously, composting is not the best thing you can be doing with waste food. First and foremost, produce less waste food. And that's more systemic solution, but that's really the ultimate solution, is produce less and then figure out how to rescue that food to feed people, first and foremost. And only when other options are exhausted, like feeding animals, then composting becomes your best and highest use. And around here, we usually we're composting and commercial food scraps that are sent for commercial processing are usually going for composting, but increasingly they may wind up going for digestion as well, where essentially we're intentionally creating that anaerobic environment where there's no oxygen. And then, so it produces a lot of methane, but it's in a sealed chamber where all of that methane is captured for energy production.
Hey, Ethan, quick question.
Yes.
What is the expected date for Coventry to fill up? Asks Kevin.
That's a great question, Kevin. We were a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, the answer would have been not more than about 4 years, because they had more land up there. This is Casella. It's a privately owned landfill. They did not have it permitted to dig it out and for it to become landfill cells. They have recently gotten approval from the state, the permitting to expand. And so that has now bought us another 20, maybe 30 years in the best case scenario, without further expansion and so forth. But considerably more land there now available for landfill cells. Addressing this slide here, this is just mostly a chance to address some confusion about terminology, because sometimes we talk about putting things in the compost and we're really talking about putting them in the compost stream, because compost is the finished product. So A is the compost stream, or the things that go into compost, which you're seeing in the picture are food scraps, and maybe there's some leaves in there, yeah, and paper towels. Those are all compostable items, but they are not compost. B is the compost, the stuff that the food scraps have been turned into that can go into your garden and do wonderful things for the plants there. And then C is plain old dirt, which is mostly inert material. You think of like ground up rocks, more like sand and so forth. And then, as we mentioned when we're looking at the pie chart, we're talking about organics. We use that term because it's a catch-all term that covers both the food scraps and the yard wastes that are equally compostable. Grass clippings, weeds, leaves, and so forth. And then just to make sure that we're all on the same page about why the compost is good stuff, it is biologically active. So the microbes that were involved in turning your food scraps into compost, some of them are still around and living in that material. And to the extent that there are living organisms in the material, they are outcompeting pests and diseases and fungi and things like that that would not be have good effects on your plants. So they create that natural disease and pest resistance. Compost also improves soil structure and retains water very well. It's very absorbent. And so it's a great way to combat runoff on farm fields. We have lots of issues with nutrient runoff contributing to algae blooms in the lake and too much phosphorus. Compost applied to lawns and fields is a way to sequester more water on the fields, so it's not winding up in waterways with the nutrients. And then, of course, the most obvious is that compost is full of great nutrients for plants. Essentially has fertilizer effects. These are your FBI agents. And we use that because it's what works well with the kids, but it also makes it easy for all of us to remember that it's fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. And that covers a lot of territory, that invertebrates category. And in the backyard, it really is all three that are doing the work. In our commercial process, less invertebrates involved and mostly fungi and bacteria because the temperatures are too high for most invertebrates to survive. In your backyard, you'll have lots of these critters and they'll do good things for you. Worms are obviously the most common, but or most well known perhaps, but the others are also important. And then we present our FBI agents mostly as a way to show that these are all living organisms. And so living organisms are not so different than us. They just need the same food, air, and water that we do to survive. And that's 60 to 65% water. We'll talk about that and how you know whether you're there. That's having air introduced through a variety of means. And it's food in the right ratios, which is not as complicated as it sounds, but there is a little bit of consideration there about what the food is. So for water, it's just giving it a squeeze test and not the water, giving the material in your bin a squeeze test. And 60 to 65% is basically enough to clump, but not to have so much water that it's drippy. And then, as we said, there are many different ways of adding air, including both the way that you build your pile, but also just turning it, mixing it, stabbing it, or so forth. Many ways to just get air into the core of your pile. But what you don't want is pockets that go anaerobic. You don't want areas of your bin that have no oxygen present. And then it's going to be a 3-to-1 ratio, essentially, of the brown foods, which you can think of as yard waste, leaves primarily, to 3-to-1 brown to green food. And the green food is your food scraps. So very quickly, just some ideas for collecting in the house. And this may be, if you already separate your food scraps, you probably don't need this, but some people may be new to the whole idea of separating food scraps. And there are many different kinds of countertop containers to use. The main thing is to find something that will fit on your countertop near your sink, because that's likely to be where you find it convenient to be able to scrape plates into, as well as food from prep, onion skins and carrot tops and so forth, as you prepare food in your kitchen. You may want to line your bucket with there are different options, but with something so that the food is less likely to get stuck to the sides and need to be more thoroughly cleaned out. If even something like a paper towel or a paper bag may get saturated with the liquid from the food scraps, but at least it will still allow that stuff to slide off easily and not leave residues behind. There are also compostable liners, but those may or may not break down in a backyard pile. I would suggest that stick to paper if you can, if you're using them in your backyard pile. And then anything that's going to be sitting around or get really smelly, your fridge and your freezer are your friend there. And you can also use your freezer as a way to keep stuff that you're not going to try to backyard compost, but you may want to bring for drop-off composting. You can throw it in a Ziploc in your freezer, and it can wait a few months until you next make it to a drop-off center for that. You'll obviously want to empty frequently. You'll get fruit flies probably regardless, but you'll get even more fly activity if you're not emptying your food scraps. I would say at least a couple times a week in the summer, and at least once a week the rest of the year. And then keeping your bucket free of odors can be as simple as just using some vinegar when you rinse it. Dishwasher also works. And then here are the 6 steps to composting, which we will cover in more detail. So I won't spend a lot of time here. We'll be going over that in more detail in the videos. But the first thing in terms of getting started is to pick a container. And there are fundamentally 2 different directions to go there. There's the composters, which will be most of what we're talking about today, but they're also backyard digesters, which are obviously in most cases not designed to give you methane for power generation, but they are designed to make your food scraps go away, disappear, and a way of sustainably managing them. So they're and the benefit of a digester is that you don't need to worry about making recipes, and you don't need to worry about things like meat and bones. All your food scraps can go in there, and there's no other material you need to balance out your food scraps with in the same way you do for the compost critters in a composter. So we sell green cones. That's the most common backyard digester that we know about. And we do have them available, but they are a more niche product because you do not harvest anything from them. There's no compost produced by them. They just let the food scraps disappear into the ground, essentially, or the liquid from the food scraps disappear into the ground. And we'll talk more about these backyard composting options, but there are many different products, including many different ways you can make your own. So the Soil Saver you see on the left side here is the product that we sell, essentially at our wholesale cost. And we like them because they seem to last very well. I've had a couple myself personally for years, long before I started working at CSWD. They are made from recycled material, which is great. And they stay pretty secure. But there are many other static containers like the Soil Saver in different shapes. Here you have a variety of do-it-yourself type of composters. So a pallet-based 3-bin systems are very common. 2 and 3 bay systems are simple and can be made out of many things, but pallets tend to be about the right size. And so it can be as simple as screwing a few together. You see that one of these is creative in that it uses a storm door for extra solar heat. So you're trapping heat in there to expedite the composting process. And then that's a trash can. And really all you need to do, any container can work if it has, holes in it, and you can keep the moisture levels at the right, if you can regulate the moisture. And that it can be really as small or as large as you're willing to manage too. But the bigger it gets, the harder it is to turn the material. And the smaller it is, it can be a little bit tougher because you have so little material to work with. So it's very hard to get any hot composting going. Here are tumblers. So these are ones that assist you with the process of mixing so you're able to more easily turn the whole container to mix your material instead of having to do it sort of more manually. Everything from spherical ones to ones with crank handles. The one in the upper left is called a Jora, Jora. And what's the main thing that's special about it is it has panels of insulation around the inside chambers. So that's a 2-chambered composter with insulation designed to help you retain heat better and go keep your compost going further into the colder seasons. And then these are some more general suggestions about using the feedback from your countertop container or your compost bin to change your behavior. If you tend to be wasting all the same kind of food week after week, it's probably a sign that there's an opportunity to donate that food or share with a neighbor, what have you. There's we're going to be talking about backyard composting, but I do want to acknowledge that it's tough in the winter, that only the very largest piles, bigger than any traditional like commercial container, will stay hot through the winter. You just need a lot of volume to a pile in order for the core to stay hot while the outside is insulation essentially. So you can just let it build up, and that's certainly a fine strategy, and then have it break down when it warms up again in warmer weather. But you could also consider doing a different kind of composting during those winter months when backyard composting is so tough, like vermicomposting with worms. That's done indoors. Or drop-off composting. Bring it to us at one of our drop-off centers, and that's also a good way to get rid of your meat and bones or anything that you find stubborn or don't want to put in that's compostable, but you don't want to put in your backyard bin. There are also various materials available from businesses that they may consider waste materials that can be good stuff for your bin, like coffee grounds or wood shavings. And things will break down at different rates. So just accept that and know that, you can wait longer to screen if you want to have less chunks coming out, but there'll always be stuff that you'll need to throw back into the pile or decide you're not going to continue to compost and consider it, something for drop-off composting or for the trash, like bones. Rhonda, how are we doing on questions?
You're an excellent teacher. There are no questions.
Okay. Then we will jump into the video.
So if you've decided that you want to pursue backyard composting, and that's not your only option, there are other ways you can do it, like drop-off composting. But if you're interested in pursuing backyard composting, then you have some decisions to make about how you want to do it. There are 6 steps to that process of backyard composting, starting with choosing your system, choosing a site or siting your container, the materials you add to it, picking the right materials, building your pile, letting it cook down or compost, and then harvesting from it, using it in the garden. So starting with what container or system you want to use. You have a few basic categories as options. One example is our soil saver over there. This is a very basic system. It is just a plastic box. Does not have even a floor in it, in fact, but you can either put it on something like a piece of plywood, or you can just let it rest right on the ground. It is easy to open, but does lock down. So one of its features is that it secures from pests, and it is very affordable. On the downside, you will need to turn the material by hand, so it's a little bit more labor intensive, but durable, simple, functional. If you're interested in getting a little bit more creative, you can build your own composting system. And what we would recommend is a 2 or 3 bin system. And what you see here is an example of a 3 bin system made from pallets. You can also make these from virtually anything, including cinder blocks or hardware cloth, chicken wire type stuff, and stakes. These are obviously harder to secure, but it certainly can be done, as you see here on the bay that we add to. But often the benefit of these is that it's a rotational system, so that you're adding to one bay and you're flipping it into the next bay when it's ready. The next option you would have would be some sort of a tumbler system. And a tumbler system is different than a soil saver in that it is not directly on the ground. So critters from the ground can't get directly into it, but you do not need to turn it by hand. You just need to crank it, and it does the work of adding the air and giving the critters what they need in terms of mixing the material. Finally, you have a system like what we have up here called a green cone, and that is a digester, not a composter. And there are some fundamental differences we'll get into more, but it impacts the kind of materials you can use in it, and it has a lot of implications for siting. So we'll talk about the mostly limitations around under what circumstances in terms of available siting you can use a green cone. And in fact, we might as well jump into that now, since siting is topic number 2 in planning your backyard composting. So, what you need for a green cone is well-draining soil. So it really needs to be sandy or gravelly, and you can create that yourself if you're willing to do the extra work. Otherwise, you just need to have that in the area that you choose to dig your hole for it. It also really needs direct sunlight. It needs to be aided with the heat provided by being in the sun. And so if you only can find a shady spot, that is not going to be a good fit for you, and we'd recommend a composter instead. As far as siting a composter, you are going to want to think about how to secure it. You're going to want to think about proximity and convenience. The closer to be more convenient for you, especially in the winter, if you're going to have to shovel your way out there. But also keep in mind that there will be some extra fly activity around it, so you're not going to want it right up against your house. It also can attract some critters, although if you do it well, that's less of a concern, particularly if you make it inaccessible, like as the Soil Saver does with the clamp down lids. Always good if you can get it some extra solar by putting it in the sun as well. One more oft overlooked consideration when it comes to siting your compost container or even your digester, your green cone, is tree roots. There really is a concentration of nutrients that will be emanating from your composter. And unless your composter is off the ground or you have set on something, tree roots will have access to those nutrients and they will seek them out. They will actually grow from the ground, your composter, and add root mass, especially if you're not turning it regularly. So we would suggest not siting your compost bins exactly where you see these next to the woods. Avoid trees and shrubs when siting.
Okay. Rhonda, do we have other questions coming in?
We do. Can you do me a favor though? Can you unshare the screen so folks can see our beautiful faces? Thanks.
Yes, good idea.
There we go. So there is a question. Amanda has a question, and a good one at that. She wants to know, how do you manage continuously adding material to the Soil Saver? Because it kind of seems like a finite system.
So the Soil Saver has the hatches down at the bottom, which leads some people to conclude that they add materials to the top and pull from the bottom. And I don't want to tell you not to do it that way, because that may work for some people, but I will tell you that that's not what works for me. That I want to be able to mix my material really thoroughly, which means I'm not going to be able to keep the stuff on top separate from the stuff that's finishing up at the bottom. And so I treat it as a batch composter, meaning that at some point I stop adding material to it so that it can cook down and everything can get to a similar stage. And then I have to be adding my fresh stuff somewhere else. And so in my case, it's that I have 2 Soil Savers. So one's cooking and one is for the fresh stuff, which is kind of like what you're saying with the 3-bay system. That does it the same idea, where you always add to one end or the other, and then it moves down the bays as it gets finished. It also makes it easy because as you flip it into the next bay, you're sort of automatically adding more air. So that's my solution. And same thing goes with a tumbler. I don't think you're ever going to be able to I don't think you're going to want to be adding fresh material to your tumbler when you had food scraps in there a while that are starting to actually turn into compost. Like, you're going to want to stop and let your tumbler finish. So that would be my take, Rhonda.
Excellent. So looks like you better be getting yourself 2 Soil Savers. But so like when we started doing these videos last year, Ethan and I, we had acquired the demonstration compost site And it wasn't necessarily like super well maintained prior to that. So we didn't know what to expect in the demonstration soil saver that we have on site at Green Mountain Compost, but it did have compost in the bottom. So we lifted up the little door and we shoveled it out. So it does work if you want to do it that way. It might take longer because you're a little less attentive, or you could just like give the top layer a fluffle duffle do ya, and kind of shake out what's been composted. Experiment if you only want to go with one soil saver. And as far as the tumbler goes, yeah, I mean, I think it like using two is great too. I only ever had one when I was composting outside years and years ago. But I just continually added to the tumbler as well. And then in the fall, I would just sift out like what was composted and then put back what wasn't composted and then just continued using it. So that's how I rolled with just one. But I mean, I'm a solo person, so I don't really need, it's gonna take me forever to fill up like one bin. So just an added bonus. And Kevin, I see you have a question, but next, our next video segment is all about materials and stuff that we're putting in the compost. So I'm gonna hold off on your question until after the next video, when we're done with the next video, and then I'll ask yours because it's a good question. And you are very welcome, Amanda. And that will wrap that up. So I think we can roll into video segment 2, which is what do you put in your pile and
Watering?
how to build it.
Yeah. And before we jump into that, I realized that I should have mentioned one thing about temperature. So I've referenced that, you know, you can assist it by getting it some solar heat, you know, putting your black bin out in a sunny spot, or you saw the storm door. What I should have mentioned is that if the microbes, if the FBI agents are happy, particularly fungi and bacteria, they are going to be replicating and feeding, and in doing so, producing heat. And so you don't have to provide the heat. The idea is that you provide the optimal conditions for the composting critters, and they create the heat as they become more active. That said, hot composting can be a little bit fickle, and your pile does not need to be reaching any particular temperature in order for you to be effectively backyard composting. And we talk to people that are very frustrated because they're not hitting high temperatures. And number one, it's hard to get really high temperatures unless you have a massive pile, as we do in our commercial process at Green Mountain Compost. But it also can just be tough to get it just right, so your microbes are actually producing like noticeable heat. They might be just producing small amounts of heat, and that's okay. So if you really are determined to hot compost and expedite the process, then you probably want to be making your food scraps a little bit finer, like grinding them up or chopping them up a little finer. And you are going to need to be sort of more actively managing your pile. But know that that's an ideal that you don't need to strive for. You can be perfectly happy. In fact, worm composting is done entirely in, as Rondo can tell you, entirely cold compost.
So the difference between, so Ethan's referring to hot compost and cold compost. And it's like, you know, it's really just like at certain degrees temperature, degrees Fahrenheit, the fungus and the bacteria community changes. Some can tolerate higher temperatures and some can like it at a lower temperature. Typically in your backyard, you're going to do like the medium temperature or cold composting, as people refer to it. The hot composting is just when, like Ethan said, you're probably going to have to be pretty darn attentive to your pile. We do have a coworker actually that does get our piles up in the summertime to 140 some degrees Fahrenheit. I've never had compost that hot before in my backyard when I was doing it. And my worms definitely are not getting up that hot. They're definitely, they like the medium temperatures a little better. Nothing really over 75 degrees. But so that is just the difference. It's just really like the microbial, the fungus and the bacteria communities change with the temperature. But yeah, the smaller the pieces, the more attentive you are, and the bigger the pile will get you those warmer that warmer climate. And it will compost faster the warmer the pile. But it's not necessary unless you're impatient, which most people are. All right, so now we're on to the next video, which is what can you put in your compost bin and how the heck do you build that pile?
Right.
So now I'm going to demonstrate how we use our 3-bin system, our homemade system. The third bay, as we call it, is for our leaf storage. So that's where we store our leaves. So basically we're working with these 2 bays. We've cleared this one out, sieved out all of the compost, and now what we're going to do is this one's been sitting for a while. We've been filling this one up. Honestly, I mean, you would probably want to, or you want to fill it all the way to the top. It's just for demonstration reasons, we're going to flip it halfway through. So we've got about a half a bay full. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it over into the second bay, let that cook for another year, and then next spring, check on it, see where it's at in the composting process. Hopefully we'll sift out some of the compost. Whatever the chunkies are left over, we'll put back into the system, and we'll just use, bay 1 as our new compost pile to start building once again. So that pile will sit there for the next, till next spring, just kind of hanging out. I will check on it every so often, give it a little water and dry times. Right now, you saw with that squeeze test, it's looking pretty good. So right now it's looking fine, but I will check on that probably weekly or every other week until, winter hits. Adding water where needed and giving it a fluffle-duffle do ya every once in a while to circulate and kind of mix everything together. But that is flipping the pile. And now this bay is ready to start all over again with that layering of food scraps and leaves or whatever you're using for brown food. Ta-da! All right, so you've got the kind of compost system you want or digester. We've got our site selection. So the next thing to choose is, or the next thing to address, I should say, is what kind of stuff can you compost? Well, anything that comes from a plant or an animal technically can be composted. Mother Nature is composting all the time. And that compost, the finished compost, is what's going to feed your garden or your lawn or the trees in the woods behind me. Right? Compost is humus is the technical term for compost. Right? That's what Mother Nature creates, and we, because we're impatient, like to speed things up, and because typically we tend to be a bit wasteful, we have a lot more things to compost than, say, Mother Nature does. All right. So, what kind of things? Food scraps. All right, and we're talking backyard system right now. And so in your backyard system, when you're composting, we recommend that you don't compost meat, bones, and dairy, right? And that's not because they won't compost down. It's just because critters being like raccoons and skunks and even the crows, tend to hone in on those smells and visuals. So you don't you don't really want them in it. I mean, if you don't mind, go ahead. I'll be honest, I have always composted all of my food scraps when I've composted outside. So except for raw meats and fish, I don't do that. But anything cooked, I just throw in there. So that's your choice. All right. When you're in the house, you can collect your food scraps with just about anything. Now, yes, can you get a fancy composter or food scrap collector like this one? Sure you can. And it comes with this cool little charcoal filter that kind of keeps the smell down. Right? I've had this for probably about 20 years. So this one's gonna stay with me. All right, because
I'm going to keep using it. But if you're new to the game of food scrap collection, you can use anything out there. And as a matter of fact, we recommend that you do reuse whatever you have in the house, all right? Because as you know, reducing and reusing is a more important step than even recycling, including recycling your food scraps. So here we've got an old ice cream tub. We've got coffee container. Even those little lettuces that you buy in the plastic containers can be used. And all of this fits very nicely right in the fridge, so you can keep those smells down as you're collecting food scraps, all right? Or this giant coffee thing. So again, you can collect in anything. If you want to collect at home and, or collecting in your kitchen and then take it to a larger bucket outside, which is what I do in my house, then you can collect in, you know, in anything. So here I've got an old Home Depot bucket that I had sitting around, and that's what I store all of my food scraps in until I am ready to compost them. All right, in a big batch. So, food scraps. So without food scraps, and as we learned earlier, those microbial friends, our bacteria and the fungi, and even the invertebrates, especially outside, so those FBI agents really enjoy a certain recipe. All right, so we're gonna keep in mind 3 parts brown food, like leaves, straw, wood chips, sawdust, shredded paper, all of those little newspaper things you get in the mail. Shred those up and throw them in the compost pile. Why not, right? So all of those brown foods, you want 3 times as much brown food as you do your green food, all right? Green food being all of your food scraps, all right? High in nitrogen, gives them the proteins they need to replicate. The brown foods, and today we're gonna be demonstrating with leaves, all right? Brown food gives those microbes the energy they need to get the job done, all right? So now we've got our what we would call feedstocks, that's the technical term, but all of the stuff you need to build a healthy, successful, and delicious pile of food scrap, of compost. All right, so we're gonna use our backyard 3-bin system here. And we had already turned over our working bay, all right, our working side. This is the side that's gonna be cooking down. We'll talk about that in a minute. So how do we build this pile? All right, again, keeping in mind that 3-to-1 ratio, very important. Also keeping in mind 60 to 65% moisture is really critical, and probably one of the top mistakes I see in backyard composting is that people don't think that they need to water it. Well, like you, those microbes, they need water to survive. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna, we're working on building it. It's kind of like layering a lasagna, if you will. You'll hear the lasagna method a lot. All right, so I'm gonna actually just kind of dig a little ditch in the middle here, all right? Like such, with my handy dandy pitchfork, all right? This is Ethan's favorite composting tool, the pitchfork. All right, I've got my bucket of food scraps here. All right, it's about 3/4 full. And I'm just gonna dump all of that right in the middle, right like that. All right, then I'm gonna take my bucket and I'm gonna stuff it with leaves. How many buckets of leaves do I need? 3, because I have about a bucket full of here's 3. All right, easy as that. Right like that. I'm gonna spread it out a little bit. I'm actually gonna use some leaves to throw around the sides too. I like to kind of insulate it from smells and attracting critters. And critters being, again, the skunks, the raccoons, all of that stuff. So, I'm just gonna use what's left in here to kind of insulate around the outside. Now, I tend to be a bit of a lazy composter sometimes, so I like to throw a few sticks and twigs in there. It creates air pockets for these guys to breathe. All right, so I'm just gonna shushle that around the outside a little bit.
Can you just pause the video for a second, Ethan?
Yep.
It just is, for me, really lagging. And I don't know if it is for everybody else, but like the voice is far beyond the action. So I just wanted to let the action catch up. Maybe that's not for everybody else. Maybe it's just me.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for stopping us. If people are having technical issues, feel free to let us know in the Q&A. I don't know what we will do differently, but we will slow down and see that we can get things running better.
Because for me, it's like the video's still running. I can't hear anything, but the video's still going. And I don't know if that's the if that's only my problem, that's fine. Same. Yep, lagging behind. Okay, so everybody else is experiencing it too.
Okay, good to know.
So I'm just gonna let this catch up. So hang on. It's and I don't know if you want to pull them up separately, like in their own separate file, instead of having them embedded in the.
Sure, we can work on that.
Yeah. So I'll commentate while you're now seeing the video, and Ethan finds the other thing. But so this is just me adding the 3 buckets of leaves to the 1 bucket of food scraps. Again, you just want to make sure that you're layering that up, or at least adding that amount, the 3 to 1, or very close to it anyway. And the leaves will soak up a lot of the moisture that is created from the food scraps as well. All right.
Do we have other questions, Rhonda?
No questions thus far.
Okay.
Actually Kevin does have a question, so we'll get back since we already covered what goes in it. So Kevin's asking, what about chicken poop? Can you put it in his tumbler?
I would say that chicken poop, we would advise not all like animal feces should go in your compost because you're not going to reach the temperatures that will render it safe, by killing any possible pathogens. But chicken poop is not something that we worry about pathogens with. And so that is probably great nitrogen-rich material for your compost. Carnivores, dogs and cats would be examples of where you don't want to put their feces in your backyard compost. But herbivores tend to have poop that's just fine for composting, rabbits and chickens and so forth.
Horses, all that good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the microbes really, really like it too, as do the invertebrates. Okay, so I think we're caught up there. Did you find them in the separate file?
I have the other one queued up. I'm going to just continue this one. If it goes wrong, I'll start working on finding the new one. But we'll continue here so I don't have to find the new spot.
Okay.
We're still up?
Yeah, but now I'm seeing part of your file system here.
Really?
Yep. There you go.
That's good. All right.
Yep.
Give it a little insulation. All right, so now the last thing to do. Probably got like food scraps stuck in your bucket.
No good?
Yeah. And now you stopped sharing, so yeah. No, that's not any good. I can bring it up though. I think I've got it right here. Somewhere here. All right. Webinars. Oh, there it was. Ha ha.
I'm ready if you need me to.
Oh, you ready? Okay, go ahead. If you've got them ready to go.
You are?
I'm not, but
Okay. I'll bring it up then. Yep. Hold on.
and then just forward it through wherever we were.
Then
Yeah, I just gotta find where we
Right
were.
there, that's probably good.
a little bit. I'm actually all right, easy as that.
Dependent.
Right like that. I'm gonna spread it out a little bit. I'm actually gonna use some leaves to throw around the sides too. I like to kind of insulate it from smells and attracting critters. And critters being, again, the skunks, the raccoons, all of that stuff. So, I'm just gonna use what's left in here to kind of insulate around the outside. Now, I tend to be a bit of a lazy composter sometimes, so I like to throw a few sticks and twigs in there. It creates air pockets for these guys to breathe. All right, so I'm just gonna shushle that around the outside a little bit. Give it a little insulation. All right, so now the last thing to do, probably got like a little food scrap stuck in your bucket here. Maybe you have running water out there. We do not here. So we got a bucket of water here. I'm just gonna give this bucket a nice little rinse-a-dinsel do ya. And I'm gonna pour that right over the top of my pile. Right like that. And this pile's pretty dry. So I think what I'm gonna do is go ahead and add a bunch of more water, even though it did just rain. And it's gonna rain later on this week. But because this is nice and open, it will dry out pretty quickly, and it's really windy here, so it'll dry out. You wanna keep a check on that, all right? So, we're ready to let that cook, all right, until at least the next time. So we'll continue to build this pile up. The bigger the pile, the hotter it's gonna get in the middle. And as you will see from Amy McVeigh, she can get her piles up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so then this middle pile we turned over, and this is cooking away in here. So this is gonna cure or cook away for maybe probably another year. So if you're looking for compost in like a year, less than a year in your backyard, it may happen. It may happen. I'm not saying it's not gonna happen, but it's probably not that likely, especially in an open system. And these are pretty large bays. Typically you want 3 by 3 by 3, all right? And fill it all the way up and then let it cook down. That will get the heat going, and that'll give that perfect environment for the microbes to start partying and go ahead and kick up that heat a little bit. So this is cooking, and I wanted to show you guys the moisture level. So we talked earlier about the squeeze test. My motto is always dirty hands are happy hands, so dig on in there. So if you dig on into this compost pile, and yes, it did just rain. Woo, look at that, Mac Daddy. So there is one of those FBI agents, the fantastical earthworm, all right, night crawlers. These are not composting worms, all right, don't confuse them, but they do like the compost pile because they're eating a lot of that broken down soil in there. So Ethan, can you show us what a perfect moisture, or good moisture content in our compost pile looks like?
Sure. We're gonna hope that this this compartment here has stuff that's a good example. So digging down beyond the leaf layer, there are more leaves on top to get a good mixture. We are gonna give it the squeeze test. So if I can wring water out of it, it is too moist. If it retains its shape, it is just right. Let's give it a shot. Cannot wring any water out of it, but I certainly can make a nice compost ball.
Excellent, thank you. So the Soil Saver, much like the homemade 3-bin system that we just learned about, pretty much, I mean, you're gonna do the same thing. Only thing is this thing is nice and locked down, so you just wanna twist the locks off, all right? Looks very similar on the inside. And it's a little dry, all right, because the Soil Saver does not come with these holes drilled, all right? I drilled those because we thought like it would help put rain in there. But you could always just like, if on a rainy day, just leave the lid cockeyed like that and let the natural rain come in. So you're gonna build the pile up just like you did with the 3-bin system. So I'm gonna get in here. I'm gonna just make a little hole, all right? Kind of just helps a little. Ooh, it's chilly in there. So this is my compost from home, and I'm just gonna, it's not very much, I'm just gonna put it in there. Now you'll notice too that I included some paper. I lined my compost bin at home with paper. So it's not as a hot mess to clean out at the end of the day. I also have some parchment paper in there, but I'm just gonna put that in there. I can cover this back up, all right? And because I added a little bit of a little bit of food scraps, I'm just gonna come over here and kind of guesstimate this is about 3 of those, or at least 2 of those, and just kind of spread that over. Now, to rinse my container out, maybe you have water access, I do not, but, so I'm just gonna give this a little rinsel-dinsel-do-ya, like that. All right, right like that, and I'm just gonna pour it right in here, and that'll give it a little moisture, because remember, you want it to be like squeezed. So if you check this out, like if you dig down a little further, and I get in here, and I squeeze my compost, falls right apart, all right? Squeeze, falls right apart. That's not what you mean. That is way too, not enough moisture, all right? What you would rather is, maybe if we dig down deeper, it's nicer down in the bottom. We'll see. So what you want is, yeah, even that's too dry. The whole pile is too dry. So all we need to do is add a bunch more water. So thankfully, I brought a bunch with me. And so that's how I would be fixing this pile. Probably even a little bit more. I'd probably just be dumping some in there like that. Because if it gets too wet, you can always add more leaves just kind of to level it out. All right, so we're ready to go. Boom, done. Put the lid back on. Snap it back down. Nice and secure. There, you've just created your soil saver compost.
Sorry for the technical issues with that video, everyone. Wait till people have questions. But I'll use this opportunity just to make sure that we did cover adequately what the greens are versus the browns. Obviously, it's not about the color of the stuff. We just use those as categories to sort of generally talk about the nitrogen-rich materials, which are generally your food scraps, and the carbon-rich materials, which are the browns, which are generally woody materials like leaves, wood shavings, or paper and cardboard. As long as they're clean, they don't have coatings on them or packing tape and things like that. Shredded paper and cardboard can be great browns. Anything else that we should be covering, Rhonda, before we jump in?
I think that's it. Amanda thought it was great to know about the water, so that's great. And I think for me, looking at people's backyard bins, and I have plenty of friends who I've strong-armed into composting in their backyard. So then, of course, I'm like their go-to technical person. But even like traveling around and chatting with the people in Chittenden County, the 2 top things that go wrong in the backyard bin is not enough water, never moist enough, and not that 3-to-1 ratio of leaves or brown food to your food scraps. So if you follow those, give it a little fluff every once in a while, I think you'll find, if you have been having issues, then I think you'll find that will help with the situation greatly. The water is really critical to the movement of bacteria and fungal spores, but also to their replication. So, and if they're not happy, guess what? Composting isn't going to happen, because we act like we're doing the compost and we're not doing anything. We're setting up spa conditions for our good buddies, the FBI agents, to really do all of the hard lifting. All right, our next video is
Harvesting.
Dang. This is
this is about the payoff. All right, screen sharing.
So, now that you've let your pile cook down, and again, it might take like a year or so, maybe 2 years, depending on how hands-on you are, or how happy your microbes are. So now it is time to harvest. So we actually sieve out our our compost so that we can throw the chunky monkeys back in to continue composting, or the leaves that are covering up the pile. Now this pile hasn't been cooking very long, so we're probably gonna have a lot of chunky monkeys in there and definitely a lot of leaves. So don't base it upon this. This is just kind of a new pile. So I think this is started in probably like October of last year. So obviously not composting much over the winter. So we have made a sieve out of old 2x4s and some hardware cloth. You can do it however you want. This is the time to engineer, guys. All right, get on those engineer hats. So we're gonna dig down in here, and we're just gonna throw it on here. Now it did just rain, so this is like really wet stuff too, but and as Ethan said, siting it along a tree line is not the wisest thing, and that's just because I just dug into a bunch of roots as well, because they're just coming up and eating it. So you can just move this all over the place like this. The bits of finished compost will fall into your wheelbarrow, or I use a tarp actually at my own house, because I actually compost with worms, so it's a little different. And all right. And typically you wouldn't do this when it's like saturated and wet like this, but sometimes you just got to take opportunity where opportunity lies with the weather these days. All right, so like I said, this isn't cooking down all that long, but we're gonna we didn't get much out of there. But we did get, that is the finished compost right there. All right, and I can see some things moving around in there. Oh, there's a little spider, so don't be afraid. It's all fine. They're all compost critters, all right? They're all our friends. All right, so this stuff is ready to go on your garden and feed those bean plants, feed those spinach plants, or even your flowers. Now, harvesting from the soil saver is very similar, except you got a little door right here. And again, I don't really know what to expect in here. So you've got a little door and you can just kind of shovel it out from underneath. Oh, look at that. All right. Ha. That actually looks pretty darn good. So there's some eggshells in there. Is that gonna hurt your garden? Absolutely not. They will break down eventually, all right? So don't worry if there are little pieces of food still left in there uncomposted. You can just turn that right into your soil. It's really not that big of a deal. So that is Harvesting 101.
So one piece of feedback that we've recently gotten from someone who attended one of these webinars is that seems like a whole lot of work for very little payoff with a little bit of compost that was harvested. And so I do want to emphasize that was for demonstration purposes. Normally we would not try to sift compost that clearly has a lot of ways to go. Like that was mostly leaves. So that is going to not yield a lot. And it was just done at that stage for demo purposes. But you can see that there is good stuff to be, even when you may have solid food scrap still in there and leaves, the stuff that's broken down, that's a way to capture it. And if you're in a hurry to get as much as you can as soon as you can, you just got to sift it. Some people choose not to sift at all and just let it go a little longer, and they don't mind having some larger chunks in their garden, and that's fine too.
Yeah. And like I said, Ethan and I inherited this whole project thing. So we were like making the videos. I think this was like in April of last year. And so we were just like, there's not much we'll just gonna go with what we've got. And so that's why I said that's what we did. But this year we're gonna reshoot the videos, and we've been much more mindful of the compost site than we were than in the past, or people were in the past. So hopefully we have some better video to share with people this coming year.
The other thing we didn't show off is that one of the nice things about the soil saver is because it doesn't have a floor, you can pick up the whole unit and move it next to where it was. And then you have very easy access to the pile. It's easier to shovel out. Or if you're just using that to mix it, then you just shovel it back into the soil saver in its new spot right next to it. It just makes it a little bit easier to do the shoveling, and gets a more full mix than you would trying to stir it all inside the soil saver.
And so something else that Ethan and I are going to be experimenting with this year, not to be like, woohoo, bring on the cold weather, since we haven't really quite warmed up even to like warmish temperatures yet, but we actually built like a little cage around the soil saver. And so we're going to try doing some like insulation and brown food storage, and like stuff it with leaves around the actual soil saver, and see if that helps retain some of the heat further into like the fall or winter season, and helps it thaw out a little bit earlier in the spring season. So stay tuned for that fantastic experiment. And we won't have the true results until like next year, but just keep coming back. So yeah, I mean, there is no other questions, Ethan.
Okay. Well, I'll just mention a couple of things that I think are cool about composting. One is that it can be as active or as passive as you want it to be. So we're trying to show you some of the best practices here, but the reality is that if you just throw your food scraps in a container in the backyard and only check on them, and add browns every 6 weeks or more, that's okay. And you might not end up with finished compost as quickly. It might be a little bit more, you might have a few more odors in the meantime, but ultimately you can still wind up with great compost, because no matter how far to the slimy and stinky side of things, or dried out even, your compost gets, it's always easy to save it. The only way to really ruin your compost is to put something that's toxic in it, like cleaning chemicals. But otherwise, it can always just be rescued by adding more browns if it's slimy and stinky, or if it's dried out, adding more water and moisture.
On that toxic note, something that Ethan and I just recently learned, or maybe you knew it, I did not actually, but that I guess compost, your compost pile can be potentially toxic to dogs that get into it. So for your dog's sake or your neighbor's dog's sake, just make sure that your compost pile is secured, because obviously, they like stinky, smelly things. And we'll have, is that in our follow-up email, a link to that? Yeah. We will be sending up a follow-up email to you guys with a whole resource page on it for your reading pleasure. And that is actually one of the resources. So if you're concerned, not a reason to deter composting, it just is something to be aware of, while you're composting.
Nice.
My dog, and I mean, I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying, my dog has eaten lots of compost in his life, and he's not with us now, but he was actually 16 years old when he died. So, not from eating compost, but it may not affect all dogs.
Yeah, it's a particular fungus that may be present in your compost pile, might not, but it can be present in compost piles, and so that's the reason to be aware. And of course, it's a good idea to secure your pile anyway, so that you're not becoming the neighborhood, you're not feeding the neighborhood wildlife, which is never a good thing. But Rhonda did emphasize a point that I just want to circle back to, which is that your compost pile is a great place to experiment. So will a big thick grapefruit, half a grapefruit rind break down? I don't know. Check it out. My experience, yes. I found that avocado skins are really tough, and they're always the last thing, but that if I shred them up a little bit before I throw them in, then they really break down much more in line with this, at the same rate as everything else. So there's lots of that kind of stuff that we encourage you to find out for yourself by using your compost pile as your lab.
Yes. Dirty hands are happy hands, guys. They truly are. Science has proven that. But there are no questions.
Okay, well, let's let everyone go. We do have another video about the green cone that we won't show today unless people are interested in, and we will also make it available, as a resource. So you can always check it out later. But it's specifically about the green cone and how to install it Again, it needs well-draining soil and sunlight. Can't put any leaves in it or any paper in it. It's just for food scraps. And you don't harvest anything out of it. Just manage your food scraps easily by throwing them somewhere and not having to think about them again.
All right. And Kevin says, great class. Thank you, Ranjan. Ethan, Kevin, thank you for coming. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Stephanie. You guys have a spectacular Tuesday.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Bye-bye.